morning, Gold Creek. How you doing this morning? Hey, let's try it one more time. How you doing this morning? Good, man. Good. Hey, if you're joining us online as well, want to say welcome to you. So glad that you're here today. We're going to jump into the message here in just a moment. We got to get rolling today, but I want to let you know this. Right after this service, right here in this very room, we do something periodically here at Gold Creek. It's called Discover Gold Creek. It's about an hour. Some churches have like a formal membership. This is the closest thing to that we have. Some of our staff and team are going to be here. You'll get to hear why we do things. Childcare is provided. You can check your kids into that. Lunch is provided. So you don't have to be registered. You can just show up. A number of you are registered already. And I hope you'll join us today for Discover. It's a way to sort of define the relationship between you and the church here at Gold Creek. So I hope you'll join us for that. Also, I want to let you know next Sunday, we are starting a brand new message series. It's called Relationship Rehab. We're going to be looking at all kinds of relationships, intimate relationships in our lives, friends, family members, those dynamics, all that fun stuff. And at the very end of that series on October 27th on Sunday, Dr. Les Parrott is going to be here with us. If you're familiar with Les and Leslie Parrott, they're New York Times best-selling authors, all of that. And he's going to be with us here on Sunday morning. So hope you'll make plans to join us for that. Hey, let's jump in right away. In fact, if you'd pull your outline out of your program, we're going to get to those verses here in just a second. And today we are wrapping up the message series that we've been in called School. And we've been looking at two sections of the Bible. We've been looking at Matthew chapters 5 through 7 and Luke chapter 6. And in these passages of scripture, we have what we call the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. It's where Jesus sort of addresses en masse, like all of the challenging issues of humanity. We've talked about things, Pastor Mike last week, hope you enjoyed hearing from him. We talked about how we find security in an uncertain or an unsure world, how we put our hope and faith in Christ above anything else. A week before that, we talked about navigating sexuality and power dynamics between people. We've talked about what happens when bad things happen or bad people seem to do well. What do we do with that as followers of Jesus? And really throughout the series, we've sort of looked at the external ways that we navigate life here on earth, what Jesus says about these external relationships. But today, as we finish the series, here's what I want to do is look inwardly. Ask the question, what does Jesus say about my internal heart posture? What does Jesus have to say about who I am on a core level? In your outline right there at the top, there's two sections of Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, and Matthew chapter 6, verse 22. Matthew 5:3 says this, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." We'll come back to that in just a moment. And then in Matthew 6:22, Jesus says, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light." In other words, what Jesus is saying is there's something, you can be healthy or unhealthy based on your view, based on maybe for the sake of this message today, how you see yourself. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." This is a really important verse. It's important because this is the very beginning of what we would call the Beatitudes, of the Sermon on the Mount. This is sort of the on-ramp into it. This is the first thing that Jesus says. Maybe we could say it this way today. Jesus says, this is how you're gonna get it right. Everything else we're gonna talk about navigating power dynamics and setbacks and challenges and financial security, all these other things that Jesus says, I know you're dealing with. Jesus says, first and foremost, this is a heart posture that I'm going to invite you into. And the challenging part about that is people don't exactly know what Jesus means. People have speculated over the years when Jesus says, what does it mean to be poor in spirit, people have sort of had these attempts at it. It's not always super clear. Sometimes you read the Bible and it just makes a lot of sense to you. Other times you read the words of Jesus and you say, I don't really get it. And maybe this is one of those times. So we know that it's complicated, and yet we know it is of utmost importance how we embrace this idea of being poor in spirit. And what I want to do is just look at a few different ways, just as we get started. How have people interpreted this? Now, some of this conversation, it has words that are a little bit bigger, maybe that are a little more complicated. It's just a way to say, hey, here's some new, because this topic's so important, here's some language around this that might be helpful. Here's what I know is that in this part of the country where we live, the Seattle area, 2024, man, you or I can pull up to a coffee stand, right? And it's almost like we speak another language to the barista. If people were in another part of the world or another part of the country, like, I'll tell you my drink, just so you know, you can write this down if you want to bless your pastor, that's cool. And if I said the phrase, hey, I would like a triple tall cappuccino extra dry with 1 raw sugar, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, a few of you speak coffee. Keep your hands up. These are the real Jesus people. Okay, and you know what I'm trying to say when we say that. So that's all we're doing. This is just some language around how people have interpreted what Jesus is saying. Maybe 3 attempts that I don't think quite get it all the way right. The first attempt, when Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, especially that phrase, poor in spirit. People have interpreted this as a moral inability. Maybe the big church word for it would be total depravity. Maybe you've come from a church background and you've heard this idea before, that when Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, it's the idea that until we admit and recognize that we're totally morally bankrupt, that we're depraved, that we're worthless, that we're no good, God can't begin to work in our lives. One, maybe a simpler way to say that would be, until we realize we're really, really bad, we can't realize that God is really, really good. Sure, Jesus could be describing this idea that we have to come to the point where we say, man, we don't have it all figured out. I know a lot of us in the room, many of us watching online, especially if we've crossed the line of faith, we've all gotten to that point. God, I can't do this on my own. God, I need your help. And yet, if we look back on our lives, we might recognize that even when we didn't realize it, even when we didn't know God, that God was working even in those unknown moments. So I'm not sure that this idea of total depravity is what Jesus means when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Another interpretation over the years is this idea of anti-materialism. The way to say that in church world is this idea of liberation theology. It's the idea that when Jesus says poor in spirit, he just means literal poor people. That Jesus, liberation theology, maybe you're familiar with it. It's the idea that God is always on the side of the poor, of the oppressed. God's always on the side of people in that category, and it's because they're poor and because they're oppressed that God's the one who's advocating for them. Now, it's no secret that if you were to read scripture, if you were to read through the life and the teachings of Jesus, man, Jesus is always advocating for people on the margins. Jesus is always, in fact, even when it's countercultural, even like Pastor Alex was talking about a moment ago in our generosity moment, Jesus is making room for people on the outside looking in. So this is an important part of it, but it's not Jesus's whole mission. The idea that the problem with this interpretation, if we say that, well, Jesus just means poor people, well, it means that the primary mission of Jesus then is social reform. What Jesus has come to do is refine society and make a new world and a new culture, and Jesus has come to do that, but that's not his primary mission. Primary mission of Jesus is to invite us to a heart posture of internal redemption. And then finally, this other interpretation is the idea of pervasive divinity or pantheism. When Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, maybe he means people who are kind of like him, but they're not all the way there. They got a little bit of God, but not enough of God. And so maybe poor in spirit just means that we're all like little gods walking around navigating life. And here's the reality, man. We say this here at Gold Creek, and this is a really common idea in our world today. Here in 2024 in the Seattle area, the idea that we're all divine in our own way, we don't have to look very far. We don't have to talk to too many people before people might say, well, that's what I believe. And here's what the scripture teaches, just to be clear on this, that we all don't have an innate divinity on our own, but we've all been made in the image of God. People have value and worth because every single person we interact with, no matter what background they come from, no matter what their economic status is, they all have the image of God on their hearts and on their lives. So this idea of pervasive divinity is not quite it. So what does Jesus mean? When Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, what is he talking about? Here's an option and really a definition that I want to work from today. The idea of redemptive theology, a rejection of self-righteousness. When Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, I think what Jesus is describing here is a heart posture that says, man, I can't do it on my own. I need God's help. Maybe he's been working in my life. And what I want to do is I want to reject any sense that I can get this done on my own. There's a definition of redemptive theology. The idea, it's a spiritual posture of acknowledging our need for God and our dependence on God's grace. And so what does it look like for us to live into that? How do we live into the redemptive theology that maybe God invites us into? Number one, if you're following along, we live out redemption by rejecting the pull toward legalism. We reject the natural gravitational pull maybe toward legalism. Let's talk about this for a moment. In Matthew 5:18 and 20, Jesus says this, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. That's one hand. We're going to put that on the shelf for a moment. And then on the other side, Jesus says, for I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of God. Now, Jesus is saying two really important things here, and I want you to lean into this just for a moment if you would. Jesus is saying two really, really important things, and I think they might speak to some of us in the room, some of us online, who might be navigating fear in regards to a changing world around us. I heard a cool stat from our staff this week that normally throughout the year, some of you know this if you're part of Gold Creek, is that on Tuesday nights, we have the building open. We have Alpha going here. It's awesome. There's kids groups. And in fact, this round, we've had to triple our footprint. We've opened the building on Monday and Wednesdays as well. I didn't even know that. And just people are looking for, I often don't know what's going on at our church. I just talk here. Anyway, but it's the idea that, man, people are hungry for connection, right? People want to connect with one another. And I want to say this because maybe in these conversations, perhaps some of us find ourselves revisiting a fear around a changing world. Fear around the fact that society is going the wrong direction or some of and the world's not living according to God's principles. And that may be true. That is concerning. And I just want to speak some hope into this moment though, because what Jesus is saying for all of us, the first part of this is that the law that God's established, God's purposes for the world, how God is going to accomplish all things in his time at the end of time, these things will come to pass. Man, that is good news in an uncertain world. I love what God's doing tonight. In fact, a little shameless plug. Tonight we have our Rep Your School night in our high school ministry. And it's a big event we do in the fall. All the schools come together. You can represent. If you're here and you got a Letterman jacket, you can come. Uncle Rico, that's cool. And just kidding. And but what I love about what's happening in our high school students, it's students who are saying, I found hope in an uncertain world. I found a foundation when the world's changing around me. And I want to invite us to put our feet on that same foundation here today. In a world of deep fakes, of AI, of fake news, right? And in a world that's increasingly concerning, Jesus Christ says that if heaven and earth were to pass away, if everything you knew were to pass away, if that weird government conspiracy that you don't even want to admit you've been researching on your own, if that came true, Jesus says that God's law, what he's established, would still come to pass. Man, I don't know about you, it's good news. It's good news in an uncertain or a shifting world. So Jesus says on the one hand that we want to put our faith there, put our hope there. But then on the other side of it, he says something really interesting in the next part of the verse. At the very same time, Jesus is saying that God's law is unchanging. He's also saying that if you were to follow that law perfectly, if you were to do everything it said, you would never be able to do enough right things in the right way. And it's interesting, Jesus, in fact, uses the example of the Pharisees. He says, these are people who get it right in a lot of areas. And if you want to be right before God, you could outright the most righteous people in the whole society, and it still wouldn't be enough. In fact, I think Jesus recognizes this pull that might be happening there. This idea of legalism, maybe you've heard that word before. And legalism is not following the law that God's established. Jesus says that's really, really important to do. If you're here and you're kicking the tires of faith, or you're new to your relationship with Jesus, man, I would encourage you, find community, find a group, find a place to plug in, find a way to continue to align your lifestyle and your heart according to what God describes. But doing those things on their own are not going to justify you before God. Legalism is not following the rules. Legalism is believing that because you follow the rules, you have a spiritual superiority to people around you. The idea that I do enough things in the right way, so I'm better than this person. Jesus is constantly inviting us off of that stance. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the people who have recognized our need for God. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for it's by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves. It's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And if we're gonna reject this pull, it's really about making sure that, number two, that we continually revisit your own stuff. Come on, we gotta continually revisit your own stuff. If you've been around church for a little while, you probably know this verse, Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. It says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? Jesus is using this idea of hyperbole. And if you'd say, hey, what's he talking about? He's kind of making a joke, right? Sometimes Jesus makes jokes. And he's saying, hey, you may have a speck of dust. You see a speck of dust, but you don't realize you got this big log, like you have a branch protruding from your own eye. And Jesus is saying you got to recognize and revisit your own stuff. What's he saying here? Is he saying to constantly revisit your own sin and recognize how bad? I don't think so. I think what Jesus is inviting us to do, what this instruction is inviting us to do, is Jesus is saying that don't allow how God works and where God works to become a limitation in your life. I don't know about you, in the year 2020, a this phenomenon swept the nation. It was called the Tiger King. Anybody remember Tiger King, watching that? Yeah, you don't have to admit it's cool. Many of you watched it. I know it did well. Okay, and so I remember being, pinned down in my house and just watching this fascinating show. If you never saw Tiger King, this was the idea. Really, really weird guy who domesticated wild cats. Okay, that was the show in a nutshell. And what would happen is he would have these lions and these tigers sort of in his possession, and every once in a while, he thought they were real cute and cuddly, but then they would like turn on one of the handlers. And of course you're watching the show thinking like, well, of course, right? Like, of course that's gonna happen. It's a tiger, it's a lion. You can't tame a lion or a tiger. One of the ways that Jesus is described in the New Testament is as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And I think as we revisit our own stuff, as we recognize God working in our lives, maybe one of the things God is gonna do is he's gonna allow this log in our eye that limits our vision of who God can use and how God can use them to move out of our eye. That our vision's gonna expand, that God's gonna do what God's gonna do, how God is going to do it. So we continually revisit our own stuff. If we're gonna lean into the redemption of Jesus Christ, man, that's an important place to be. Number 3, we embrace transformation over image management. The idea that if we're gonna live into redemption and live out redemption, we want to embrace transformation over simply image management. I don't know about you, I've periodically, every once in a while, I've been around some people who are really successful. Maybe it's high-powered business leaders or political leaders. Been around some professional athletes and people who are just leading at the highest levels of our world and our society. And maybe like you, if you've ever been around this group of people or this demographic, you've noticed that oftentimes the people at the highest level, they tend to have a very curated and managed image. It's the idea that you only see the version of them that they want you to see. They only let people in so far. In fact, there's something called the Image Management Index, and this is out there. There's other versions of it, and it essentially manages like what value you place on managing your projection toward people. And if we're gonna live into redemption, what's gonna happen is that over time, Jesus is gonna invite us to leave behind our carefully manicured or our carefully curated image of ourselves and begin to live into redemption. And that can be really scary, and that can be really difficult to do. It can be really difficult to say, hey, I'm gonna be honest, if with no one else, at least with myself. Right? I'm gonna allow God to transform me at the most transparent and deep level. And this is really difficult to do. In fact, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. It's a really difficult thing to do. I think what Jesus is describing here, obviously he's describing like salvation in him first and foremost, but I think also Jesus is describing that this narrow gate, this narrow road, what's gonna be really difficult is people who can say, I wanna embrace transformation on the deepest heart level of my life. This is a series called Schooled, and so I wrote out a little equation for us of kind of what we're aiming for at Gold Creek on this front. Here's our goal as a church, that we would have the God's truth plus high grace plus low shame. And in that, we would have an opportunity, a context for transformation. God's truth, we're gonna tell you the truth, but to say, man, we're all broken, we're all jacked up, we all got ways to go, so we're gonna extend high grace, and this is a place, low shame, where it's okay to not be okay. You don't have to have it all together. And with those three ingredients, with those three components, what we're gonna have, so we're gonna have an opportunity where people's lives can continue just like they are every single week, where their lives and their hearts can transform and they can step into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Our tendency, though, as humans, is to do this, is to say, especially in a church setting, well, we have God's truth, we have objective truth, we have low grace. Man, I'm worried that people are gonna see the real me or know the real me, and so I'm not changing as fast as I want to, so I'm managing my language and I'm managing my image and all these things, and that creates high shame. And in that, the result is you have a managed transparency. You have a managed transparency. I have this image of what I want people to see. And so, man, for us as a church, the reason we tell the stories we do and use the language that we do, you're like, how do you live this out? You can come to Discover and find out a little bit more, but the reason we do things the way we do is because we're trying to create an environment here on Sunday mornings and throughout the week where there's God's truth and high grace and low shame so that we can continually live into transformation. I just finished this book. It's called Crying in H Mart, and it's by Michelle Zauer. Some of you might know it's about, I related to it. It's her kind of a biography, her mom's journey with cancer, and her mom ends up losing this battle, and her mom's Korean, so she's half Korean, and just kind of all of the components that go into that. And her mom said something so fascinating, I thought, in the book. Her name's Michelle, and she said that her mom would always tell her, Michelle, you have to save the last 10% of you for yourself. Don't give all of it away. You got to save that part for you. And I know what she's talking about. You probably do too. Man, it's scary to let people all the way in. And what happens if they don't, you got to have a part that's just for you. But throughout the book, what ends up happening is that 10% that her mom held on to, there was a lot of pain, a lot of hurt there, that ends up bubbling up to the surface. And what we want as a church is this is not a place where you have to manage the last 10%. Man, for this to be a place where you can be fully known by God, by someone else around you, over time, it's gonna take time, and it's gonna be a journey, and it's gonna be a process, but you can live into the transformation that God might be inviting you into. And listen, that you might say, that sounds too scary for me. That sounds too daunting, Nick. That's too big of a step. And if that's you, man, I wonder and I'll be honest with you, I wonder if the vision you have about following Jesus, how you think about what Jesus is inviting you into, I wonder if somewhere along the way you've gotten the wrong idea. Number 4, that if it's about anything other than this, then maybe you've missed it. Because number 4, what we see as we live into redemption is to make the power of grace your spiritual foundation. The invitation to make the power of God's grace your spiritual foundation. Towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, Jesus says this, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock." I love that. The visual image of the foundation of God's grace, the rock that we can build our lives on. Perhaps you're here today and you'd say, Nick, I'm not really sure if I'm trying to build my life as it relates to following Jesus. I'm trying to build it on, is it the right rules or the right relationships or the right political party or the right social system? And what Jesus says in this moment, I think, is the idea that if you're gonna build your life on the rock, it's a foundation that says, I was poor in spirit. I couldn't do it on my own. I had brokenness in my life, and I needed God's grace to be the foundation that I've built everything else on. I don't know if there's a more powerful example of this than the story of a man named John Newton. Maybe you know the story of John Newton. He was born in the middle of the 1700s, and John Newton's mom passed away when he was 6 years old. His dad was a sea captain, and he didn't know what to do, so he just followed in his father's footsteps. And by the age of 11, John Newton was a full-time mariner. Built a reputation throughout his teenage years and throughout his 20s as a man who was known for his violent temper, his alcohol abuse, sort of everything that goes with the life of a sailor. And as his career as a sailor went on, he ended up becoming the captain of a slave ship. Ended up overseeing the passage, countless passages, human cargo, human currency across what we remember as the Middle Passage. But then, a few years later, it was in a storm off the coast of Ireland. He was in the middle of this massive storm, and John Newton cried out to God. He asked God for mercy. The storm went away over time. His ship survived the storm. He survived the storm. And he ended up giving his life to God. Ended up eventually, a few years later, as God continued to work in his life, he became an Anglican pastor, and he took over this little church in a town. And in that town, there was a guy who was already a poet, and John Newton and his new friend would write poetry together. And a few years after he died, they found the book of his poems. And someone actually set his poems to music. This former slave trader, embracing what God did, embracing what Jesus Christ did for him and beginning a new life. And the most famous of those poems ends this way. It says, "I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." The idea that how he saw himself, that rejection of self-righteousness, leaned into it. The rest of the song, if you don't know it, went like this. It's a one-time thing, by the way. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Some of you know that song. In fact, the song Amazing Grace has been translated into over 50 languages. Some people after the last service said, man, that was the song we sang as my mom went to heaven. We gathered around that hospital bed. I've been in the room where families have just sort of spoken those words as someone crossed over to meet Jesus face to face. The song has been sung. I heard a story that there was a family of missionaries who had been killed by this tribe, and their kids went back, and the tribe had come to know Jesus. And then this family stood on the banks of that river with this tribe who had killed their family, and they held hands and they sung Amazing Grace. So I thought today, just a simple invitation. I don't know where you're at. I don't know, maybe you're here and you'd say, Nick, I don't know if I've ever said yes to the grace that Jesus Christ offers me. Today can be that day. I don't know, maybe you're here and you'd say, man, if I'm honest, I've been trying to follow Jesus, but it's become about all these other things, and I feel like I've lost track of it, and I feel like I'm so afraid. And maybe what Jesus is gonna do today is just invite you to step back onto the foundation of grace, of what he's done for you. I know this, team came up with this, very cool. I know these aren't the only ones, but we have several languages as we sing through it together in a moment. I know these are languages that are spoken here at Gold Creek. We probably have a lot more, but I know that this message of grace is so pervasive, so much hope in it. Will you stand with me and let's sing together?
saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. His grace that taught my heart to feel, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Power of those words, I don't have much I can say to top that off. But to repeat, I was once lost and now I'm found. I don't know where that hit you today, but my guess is that you're feeling something maybe different than you felt before at the end of a service. I want to honor that feeling and just invite you. If you need prayer, we have prayer team members at the crosses they've been praying for today. They knew we were going to end with this song. We also have a baptism class going to be happening right after service, and maybe that's your step. Maybe you finally are like, wow, I was lost, but God found me. Wherever it is, I just hope that you'll just take in this moment and this feeling that you're feeling today. God bless you. You're dismissed. Go in peace.